Unfrosted from Jerry Seinfeld. It's a comedy about the rivalry between two cereal companies and the creation of the Pop-Tart. So this movie is inspired by one of Jerry Seinfeld's stand-up bits about the exaggerated cultural impact of the Pop-Tart. At one point, he even unpacked the writing of it in an interview with the New York Times. We follow Bob Cabana, played by Jerry Seinfeld. He works for Kellogg's underneath Edsel Kellogg, played by Jim Gaffigan. After discovering that rival cereal company Post is working on a shelf-stable breakfast pastry that could reshape how the nation eats breakfast, Bob recruits Stan, played by Melissa McCarthy, to lead the development of their own pastry that will establish Kellogg's as the superior breakfast company. This is obviously a very exaggerated and surrealist spin on the actual cereal war between Kellogg's and Post, but in this movie, it was made into a parody of the space race. This movie is filled with very obvious parallels, like Pop-Tarts taking liftoff from a toaster and Kellogg's rounding up its taste pilots for press. That is only a taste of this movie's very surreal comedy. It really takes you for a ride through a very campy and colorful 60s world. It feels a little bit like Wet Hot American Summer, being a period piece filled with absurdist humor and wacky characters that are intensifying something so seemingly innocent. Throw in some breakfast mascots and plenty of cartoon-like shenanigans, and this movie really drives the point home that you should not take anything in it seriously. So they're on a mission to produce the first successful breakfast pastry, and it feels a lot like an animated Manhattan Project. And of course, they suffer a lot of interference along the way. I do think that there were too many subplots muddling the main story between disgruntled mascots, a seemingly insignificant romance, and the milk cartel intervening. This movie felt pretty scattered. The second act mostly just feels like a collection of SNL sketches, which may or may not just feel that way because of the amount of SNL alumni present in the movie. I would consider much of the humor in this movie to be pretty cheesy. The biggest problem that it has is that it has a very jarring blend of mature humor and very childish humor. I'm reluctant to call this a family movie because there are some jokes that were clearly meant for adults. For example, at one point they travel to Puerto Rico to buy a very large amount of sugar from a sugar dealer on his big fancy estate. But then this movie also has a lot of what just feels like kid humor. Like, all of the taste pilots were very cringe. I think I even recall a fart joke being thrown in there. The weird mix of humor that's definitely for adults and humor that feels utterly childish kind of just makes it feel like they didn't have a clear idea for their target audience. The cringe to laugh ratio was probably about even for me. There are plenty of dumb jokes, but there were also plenty of good laughs that I got out of this movie. And like most comedies, the bulk of the jokes were just meh, which could just be a reflection of Jerry Seinfeld's mostly subtle humor. You know, most of the jokes aren't really funny or cringe, they're just kind of bland. This movie does have a very star-studded cast. In smaller roles, we have people like Bill Burr, Fred Armisen, Amy Schumer. This movie has some pretty cool cameos, but it does sometimes feel like it's trying a little bit hard to compensate for being a little bit mediocre by making us go, oh, hey, look, it's Bill Burr. This movie rocks now. So I liked the cast with the exception of the two child actors. I'd say that recently we've been in kind of a golden age of child actors actually being pretty good at acting. But these two kids remind us of the old days. They have some silly bits that probably would have been a lot funnier if they weren't delivering them completely expressionless, like their faces were just made of plastic. So this movie overall feels confused about who it wants to be for. It kind of just feels like it's trying to please too many age demographics with too many comedic styles, and the results are pretty uneven. This movie succeeds in its attempt to be extremely cheesy and over the top, but that might be a bit too much for some viewers. So I thought this movie was fine, but I'm pretty sure most viewers are going to see it one of two different ways. Either you will think that it's a mostly pretty fun, silly movie, or you're gonna think it's total garbage. I think that this movie will best serve an older audience. For those of you who grew up in the 60s and 70s, there is plenty of nostalgia to relish in, even if all of the jokes aren't landing. For the rest of you, if you're gonna get anything out of it, this is probably just something to play in the background while you're doing something else. Like if you're just doom scrolling and you want something silly to look up at occasionally, then this might be a good one for that. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you next week with my review of If.